taunting him with a line from the Aeneid, "Is it so dreadful a thing to die?" Really spooked now, Nero returned to Rome and tried to figure out how in the hell he was going to get out of this alive. He considered throwing himself at Galba's feet and begging for mercy. Then he considered throwing himself at the people's feet and begging them for mercy, but rejected both of those ideas as likely to lead to his swift execution. So he then considered fleeing east and asking the Parthian king for asylum, but realized that that too was a ridiculous idea that would never work. He tried to sleep on it in the palace, but woke up around midnight and realized that the guard had all deserted their posts. Scared out of his wits, he searched the rooms of his friends, but found them all empty as well. Nero had been deserted. Recognizing that there was no version of this story that ended well, Nero called out for a slave or a gladiator or anyone to kill him, but no one answered, prompting Nero to exclaim, "Have I neither friend nor foe?" No one answered him, but I can answer. Nero may have had no friends, but he was certainly not wanting for foes. Finally, Nero was able to connect with a freedman who agreed to hide the frightened emperor in a villa 4 miles outside of Rome. Accompanied by a few slaves, a disguised Nero slipped out of the palace and made his way through the gates of the city undetected. Upon his arrival at the villa, he ordered the slaves to begin digging a grave, and allegedly kept repeating over and over again, "What an artist the world is losing." At some point, a courier arrived and delivered the news that Nero had been dreading. The Senate had met in an emergency session, declared him a public enemy, and announced that if found, Nero was to be beaten to death. He tried to kill himself to avoid capture, but kept losing his nerve. Began to cut through the night, though. Nero was able to focus, and before the soldiers arrived to collect him, Nero stabbed himself in the throat. When the detachment arrived, they tried to stop the bleeding so Rome could extract the full measure of its vengeance, but Nero was too far gone. As they worked on the wound, he whispered, "Too late. This is fidelity." Nero died on June 9th, 68 AD at the age of 30. He had ruled Rome for 14 years. The death of Nero marked the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, and would usher in a brief period of chaotic uncertainty known as the Year of the Four Emperors, which we'll start to get into fully next week. The question on the tip of everyone's tongue was, now that there was no Julio-Claudians left, how would legitimacy be conferred upon future emperors? Augustus had been able to establish and maintain imperial authority initially through his own personal brand of ruthless charisma, and the fact that his reign just kept going and going and going, so that by the time he died, it seemed natural that his declared heir Tiberius ought to rule. From there, it had just been an unbroken line of inheritance all the way down to Nero. But now that that line of inheritance was broken, well, what did that mean? It was like Rome was waking up after being hypnotized. Suddenly, everyone was looking at everyone else, blinking, and wondering what to do now that the Julio-Claudian spell had been broken. Nero had died with no heir, and there was no mechanism to determine which of the dozens of highly ambitious men ought to rule, nor any way to tell whether or not the masses would accept someone from outside the house of Caesar as their master. Or how about this? Maybe the Julio-Claudian period will prove to be a historical aberration. Maybe Rome can return to its republican roots. There was no shortage of questions, and no shortage of ambitious men who claimed to have the answer. Next week, we'll try to lay the foundation for the seminal year of 69 AD and give a deeper introduction to the men who will vie for the throne. But I can tell you this much already. The correct answer is Vespasian. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 68, 3 Emperors. The House of Caesar was no more. Though the name Caesar would live on as a symbol of power, authority, and legitimacy, the family itself was now officially defunct. From the moment Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon in 49 BC to the moment Nero committed suicide some 117 years later, Rome had been dominated by the Julio-Claudian dynasty. No one alive remembered a time before they rose to power, and now suddenly, without warning, they were gone. Does anyone around here have any idea what we're supposed to do now? The thing was, the initial transition from republic to autocratic empire had been midwifed by Julius Caesar and his adopted son Augustus, two men with personalities so strong that they couldn't help but shape the whole governmental apparatus to match their own individual quirks, habits, strengths, and weaknesses. Their descendants had more or less failed to live up to the standards set by the two great patriarchs of the family, but they had also more or less continued the forms and practices of governance that had been handed down to them. One of the quirks of the initial principate was that the legitimacy and authority of the emperor lay not in codified rules or a spelled-out job description. Rather, it rested on an ad hoc collection of powers that had been accumulated by Augustus personally during the constitutional settlements of the 20s BC. After his death, those powers had been passed along to his descendants for no other reason than that they were his descendants. It was an issue not of constitutional authority, but of family inheritance. So now that Nero was dead, and there were no more descendants of Augustus, would the collection of powers the family had accumulated remain bundled together and handed intact to some successor outside the family, or would they be broken up, with different pieces being claimed by different men? And the biggest question of all, if that happened, who would put them back together again? Without a doubt, the most important power upon which the emperor's authority rested was his command over the legions. In the constitutional settlements, Augustus had made sure that he claimed as his own personal jurisdiction any province that contained a significant military presence. This meant that at the end of the day, however else you might feel about the emperor or his policies, you knew that you could never match the literally hundreds of thousands of soldiers he personally commanded. This had a tendency to keep everyone in line. Part and parcel of this authority was the fact that basically every general scattered across the empire was subordinate to the emperor. These various generals may have been rivals with one another, but they could each take comfort in the fact that they all answered to the same man, and were thus in a sense all at least equal to each other. But when Nero died and this uppermost slot in the chain of command was lost, all of those same generals were now technically subordinate to no one. Well, maybe they were subordinate in some abstract way to the Senate and the people of Rome, but that was neither here nor there. The Year of the Four Emperors, then, is best understood as a competition between the leading regional generals of the time to climb into that uppermost slot on the chain of command left vacant by Nero. Galba came from Spain, Vitellius came from the Rhineland, and Vespasian came from the east. While the Julio-Claudian emperors had commanded a force so large it was impossible to match, each of these men controlled forces that were large enough to prompt high ambition, but not so large that they couldn't be met in the field by a force of equal size. And as much as regional politics played a role in why the various legions backed this or that general, the individual personalities of each of the four emperors, Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and Vespasian, played a significant role in how events played out. As I mentioned last week, the man who ascended to the throne upon the death of Nero was Servius Sulpicius Galba. Born in either 3 or 5 BC, he was an old stock patrician and the son of a prominent attorney who had served as consul during the reign of Augustus. An undistinguished man, the elder Galba was best known for the fact that he was a hunchback, a birth defect endlessly mocked by the notoriously un-PC Romans. Augustus himself was even said to have poked fun at the hunchbacked lawyer. Galba's mother was the granddaughter of Quintus Public, who had defeated the post-Sullan coup led by his consular colleague Lepidus, and then stood firmly opposed to Pompey, Crassus, and young Julius Caesar as they rose to prominence, and would have been one of the first triumvirate's key opponents had he not died just before its official formation. Galba was proud of his relation to Catullus and used the great old senator's career as the model for his own life. His mother, however, died shortly after his birth, and young Galba was subsequently raised by his father's second wife, a beautiful and wealthy woman who would posthumously adopt Galba and leave him a fortune, so long as he carried on her family name, which Galba did, though only officially. He had an older brother who made some attempt at a public career, but was plagued by scandal and poor judgment until he committed suicide during the reign of Tiberius after being passed over for a proconsular promotion one too many times. Galba himself rose quickly up the ranks, serving as praetor in 20 AD and then consul in 33. During Tiberius's reign, Galba caught the eye of the Augusta, and was brought into her sphere of influence. But of course, this put him at odds with the emperor, who did not get along with his mother at all. When Livia died in 29, she left a generous bequeathal to Galba, but as executor of his mother's estate, Tiberius first cut the number down by a third, and then simply refused to pay it out. When Tiberius died, though, one of the first things Caligula did to curry favor with the aristocracy was to restore all those inheritances that Tiberius had canceled or confiscated over the years. This sudden windfall had the intended effect on Galba, and he remained loyal to Caligula even as the emperor's erratic behavior became unsustainable. He remained loyal to the Julio-Claudians throughout his career, and wound up serving administrative and military functions in Gaul, Germania, Africa, and finally, Hispania. He did, however, go into retirement during the early years of Nero's reign, though, as Agrippina continued to nurse a heavy grudge against him because Galba had once publicly refused her romantic advances. But after Nero killed his mother, Galba returned to public life, and in 61 AD he was posted to Hispania Tarraconensis, the largest of the Spanish provinces. He would serve as governor there for the next 7 years until he was declared emperor in 68, first by his own men and then by the Senate. Galba had a reputation for being a humorless throwback conservative in the mold of Cato the Elder. The Romans disliked extremes in either direction, so while the enormously wealthy Galba was always hailed for his restraint, he was also criticized for erring too far on the side of frugality. Throughout this period, though, he stands out as one of the few generals who did not actively bribe soldiers to join his cause, a practice he thought immoral and unnecessary. This refusal to bribe his men gets to the heart of another of Galba's most notable personality traits, his belief in strict and unquestioning discipline. He did not feel inclined to hand out bribes just because he was a miser, but also because an army should naturally obey its general. One should not have to convince soldiers to fall in line. One should simply order them to do so. And not only did Galba expect his men to follow his every command precisely, he also expected them to do no more than he had commanded either. Disobedience and personal initiative both were frowned upon in the legions of Galba, and as you can imagine, he both benefited from and was hurt by this approach. His reputation as a strict disciplinarian with an almost naive faith in the power of the chain of command is critical to the unfolding events of 69 AD. Following the aborted plot against his life in Germania, Caligula had brought in Galba to restore order to the legions stationed on the Rhine. Galba had apparently taken such a harsh tack with the men under his command that 20 years later, those same units would refuse to back the man that they had learned to hate, which led first to their attempt to make Virginius emperor, as I mentioned last week, and then later to their elevation of Vitellius. By the time the events that would define Galba's career unfolded, he was already an old man, about 70 years old, give or take. And as a result, his flagging energy led him to rely more and more on a core circle of advisors. Ironically, the man who believed so strongly that every subordinate was merely an extension of his own will was now widely rumored to be a wholly owned subsidiary of his three closest advisors, who became known as the Three Pedagogues because they taught Galba everything he needed to know. The most influential was Titus Vinius, a man of senatorial rank who was, according to Tacitus, quote, the most worthless of mankind. He was dogged by scandals of all sorts, with Plutarch reporting that he was imprisoned at one point by Caligula and was later accused of stealing a golden cup after attending a dinner hosted by Claudius. He wound up in charge of a legion in Spain, and somehow, though I